Well, before I get going, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today, and also thank them for organizing a virtual conference like this. It's, dare I say, there's some good things that came out of COVID, and it's been a pity that more virtual conferences haven't been held. It just really recognizes how the philosophy community is spread across the world. And yeah, actually traveling and talking to each other can be very difficult. So yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for choosing this particular format. Okay, so I'm Mary Carman. I'm in the philosophy department at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. And I'm going to be talking about emotional commitments, which was a deliberately vague title while I figured out my paper. But I am actually going to be talking about emotional commitments. So my paper didn't go in a strange direction. All right, so, oh, how do I get this to move? There we go. All right, so just to get started, I want to give a couple of examples of what I'm going to be calling emotional actions that Elizabeth Pashery talks about and describes. I think that it's a nice example, so I'm just going to use her words here. So she writes, if somebody infuriates me, say by bragging about how he got a promotion over me by cheating and slandering me, I may react impulsively and say, slap him in the face for his impudence. Alternatively, I may form the intention to get even and use the machinery of practical reasoning to devise a plan for attaining this goal. So these are both examples of actions being very much driven by emotion. And emotions do form patterns of response, and we frequently are sort of emotional agents, that we act on the basis of our emotion, and frequently without some mediating judgment or substantive deliberation about what we ought to do. So in the first example here, the impulsive slapping, that action is impulsive. And in the second example in this from Pashery here, this this devising a plan to attain the goal, there's only a basic level of means-end reasoning going on here. But the intentions and the actions are very much being driven by emotion. And I'm interested in whether or not we can meaningfully make sense of these kinds of actions as rational, or as the actions of a rational agent in quite a rich way. So here's an initial consideration for why we should take this possibility seriously. Emotions, even understood as paradigmatic sense as feeling states, are not just feelings, but crucially involve some form of intentional engagement with the world. Our emotions are about things in the world. This intentional element has led some philosophers to argue that emotions can have an important role in our rational agency, largely by being connected to reasons. And my contention in this paper is, yes, we can indeed meaningfully make sense of these types of action as rational. So here I'm on board with those philosophers giving a rational role to emotion, and I'm not going to defend this starting point. But where I'm going to differ is that I'm going to propose that the best way to make sense of emotion's rational role is actually to think about them as involving commitments to action, rather than going back to reasons all the time. Is there a sort of a different way in which we can understand their involvement with action? So let's be clear. By emotional actions, I'm interested in examples like these ones on the slide, which I'm starting with. These are actions that are candidates for being intentional actions. They are under the agent's control and awareness as the action that they are. They're potentially even rational actions in the sense of being an action done for a reason, quite loosely at the very least. Crucially though, they're going to be actions that don't necessarily involve a mediating judgment or some deliberation to endorse the action choice. But they do involve an action tendency, which is often interpreted as a motivational force in the literature. The paradigmatic examples would be those like what Pashery calls impulsive actions. Get that there. So impulsive actions are ones where whatever reasoning takes place, it is reasoning prompted by the present situation and remaining within its bounds. So slapping the colleague in infuriation would be an impulsive action. Another example that Pashery gives is running away from a fearsome bear. So that's quite impulsive, but she allows that there can also be a minimal form of reasoning in that, well, I might also have this very minimal reasoning that to get away from the bear, I need to slip between the small crack in the rocks, which the bear can't fit through. So it's very minimal reasoning. So it would still fall under this impulsive action because that reasoning is still remaining within the bounds of the situation. Amongst emotional actions, I also want to include what Pashery calls semi-deliberate actions. And these, as she writes, are ones where the agent undergoes emotional experience and the emotion takes control precedence of the action. But where sort of defining feature of this type of action is that the situation does not afford the agent with means of satisfying the associated action tendency, but where the action tendency is still what informs an intention to pursue the goal. So such actions are short-sighted and only semi-deliberate because they do not involve full deliberation and remain very much driven by the emotion. So the second example in that opening paragraph, devising a plan to get back at my colleague, that would be an example of a semi-deliberate action. My intention is being driven by my emotion. I'm not really thinking critically about whether I should be doing this at all. I'm just trying to find a way to do it. Now, Pashery focuses specifically on how the actions are causally explained. But my interest is slightly different. I'm interested in how we can conceptualize the role beyond causation and sort of fit it into a wider conception of rational agency. Allowing that emotions themselves are plausibly connected to reason, so that's an important background assumption, but I just don't think we should make too much of it. My question then is, can we actually develop an account of emotions, of how emotions can contribute to the rational status of an action? So another thing, just to be clear about at the outset, is that I'm not setting out to claim that all emotional actions are rational. Rather, I want to make the case that some of our emotional actions can be rational. And by rational here, I'm using the word quite loosely, admittedly. I mean something much looser than being done for a reason. I mean that the actions can be ones that are compatible with and even central to an agent's rationality. So perhaps a better way of expressing my interest is that I want to make the case that emotions can contribute in a meaningful way to the rational status of an action as an action done by a rational agent. But I'm just going to say rational action in shorthand. Now, one option for understanding how emotion might feature in our rational agency in these kinds of emotional actions is to center on a connection to reasons. So, for instance, we've got someone like Naomi Opley arguing that emotions track reasons, Carman Jones arguing that emotions are responsive to reasons, and then the sort of resulting account of action there is one where we say, well, we can act emotionally, we are actually acting for reasons. But I want to explore an alternative. I've argued elsewhere that I don't think that centering on reasons actually captures the nuance of emotional actions and runs into problems of its own. And I'm not going to rehearse those arguments here, except to the extent of illustrating my general concern as a way of framing my setup now. And this is a concern that, well, it's one thing to take seriously that emotion might have a rational role, which is exactly what I think we should be doing. But if we lose what is distinctively emotional about our emotional actions in the process, then I think we've gone wrong somewhere. So there's a basic requirement here that if we're going to be drawing in emotional actions into our picture of rational agency, well, we want to keep them as emotional, right? We don't want to just suddenly say, well, actually, there's something else entirely, or at least give a story that doesn't really make much of the particular way in which they still are emotional. So I do think that arguing that emotions have an important rational role doesn't need to require that we show that emotional actions tick all the boxes for being paradigmatically rational actions, where one of those boxes is being done for a reason. And I don't think that that should be our aim anyway. So that is why I want to motivate for looking elsewhere and specifically pursue this idea and this claim that emotions involve a commitment to action. In order to get there, though, I need to just expand a bit on what, the nature of these emotional actions is, which requires saying a bit about what I take emotions to be. And what I think is central to both emotional actions and emotions is this idea of emotions being or involving a felt engagement with the world. So how am I understanding emotion here? Hopefully, and not in a very theoretically heavy way. I've got some theoretical commitments, but I don't really want to be coming down on a particular definition of emotion. So I'm specifically interested in conscious affective states of the agent that are also intentional. And by intentionality here, I'm talking about the directedness, the world directedness of a mental state. So emotions are directed at objects that are apprehended or appraised as being a certain evaluative way. So that example of running away from the bear because it's fearsome, I'm afraid of the bear, the particular object of my emotion is the bear, and I'm apprehending it as being dangerous or fearsome to me. So there's an evaluative relation there, this what some people talk about as the formal object of emotion. I also accept two additional important theoretical claims. The first is that I accept that emotions involve action readiness, and more specifically action tendencies as states of readiness to execute a given kind of action. And secondly, I accept that emotions are a sui generis intentional feeling. Sui generis, a state of their own. They're not sort of amalgamations of beliefs, judgments, desires, affect in various ways. Now, these two claims are closely connected. The action tendencies of particular emotions, for instance, are not just a readiness to do anything whatsoever. So, if I'm infuriated with my colleague, I'm not sort of just going to do anything at all. I have a sort of a priming to do things that are related to what I am infuriated by and about. So these action tendencies are connected with what the emotion is about, which is that intentional element. Even if we talk about action tendencies in broad terms, as people do, as involving an intended result of establishing, maintaining, or disrupting a relationship with an object in the environment, there is still a close connection between the kinds of appraisals and the objects that make up the intentional content, intentional element of an emotion, and the kinds of actions towards which there is a tendency. So anger, for instance, may involve a tendency to remove obstruction. It's about something offensive and obstructing to myself. The idea of intentional feelings, in turn, is the idea that the intentional and affective elements of an emotion are intricately intertwined, such that we ought to understand emotion as a sui generis feeling state, where we experience the world in evaluatively laden ways. And there's quite a move towards thinking about emotion in this way, in the philosophy side of things at least. What's central to the sort of intentional feeling idea is that it is the feelings that are intentional. It's the feelings that have a world directedness to them. So we see that both with action tendencies and intentional feelings, there's a close and intricate connection between these affective and intentional elements of emotion. Now, if emotions are intentional feelings, then this does plausibly impact subsequent emotional actions. And we can illustrate this by considering a sort of set of contrast cases with an emotive and a non-emotive agent. I'm going to be the emotive agent here. Also happened to me on the way to work this morning. But suppose I'm already running late and I'm sitting in heavy traffic waiting to turn right into work. I think there's some of you who might be familiar with Fitz. This is Empire Road turning into Yale Road. But it's just as it is my turn to turn right, a car speeds up the bus lane on my right and blocks the right turning because they now can't get back into the heavy traffic, which they need to do if they're going to carry on going straight. So I'm sitting here and I'm seething furiously, and I want to let that driver know that they've broken the rules of the road, they're doing bad. I slam my fist on the hooter. I haven't thought about what I'm doing, and I'm not simply expressing my anger. I do want the driver to know that what they've done is not okay. And my anger here is plausibly about the other driver, that they've done wrong by breaking the rules of the road. So contrast this with the non-emotive agent, and here this can be my colleague who's a much calmer person and a much calmer driver than I am, but she's worried about the deteriorating sort of laws of the land and rules of the road. So she's decided that she wants to call out every instance of bad driving that she comes across. Faced with the exact same situation as me, wanting to turn right, but now got a car blocking the right turn because they're in a lane that they shouldn't be in, she also hits a hooter. And that's because the driver has done wrong by breaking the rules of the road. Now, if the way emotion is going to feature in the action as rational in the emotive case is through its being about something that constitutes the reason, then it looks like our two agents are potentially acting for the same reason-given considerations. In this case, it's what my anger is about, which is a consideration that the driver has done wrong by breaking the rules of the road. But focusing only on the kind of reason that may be given in the intentional content of an emotion, I think risks masking the way in which the emotive and the non-emotive agent are actually acting for quite different considerations. And this can be illustrated by examining the desirability characterization of their actions, where a desirability characterization from sort of what Elizabeth Anskew makes a big deal of, is a characterization that captures how the action is seen as good or desirable by the agent. So in our two examples, we can ask, why was this action seen as a good thing to do in light of what the agents took to be reasons and therefore were motivated to act? Now, my colleague, who's the non-emotive agent, she's not angry, she's motivated by a desire to call out bad driving. She sees the act of hooting as a good thing to do in light of the putative reason that the driver has done wrong, because it will be calling the driver out. Yet, even if I, as the emotive agent, the angry agent, share my colleague's desire to call out bad driving and see hooting as a good thing to do in light of the driver having done wrong, I also see it as a good thing to do because it addresses my anger about the bad driving by executing an action towards which my emotion primes me. Because my anger is about something in particular, I don't go about addressing it in any which way. I address it in a way that is directly linked to what it is about, and I experience that as deeply, deeply motivating. Now, crucially, we could suppose that neither the emotive or the non-emotive agent has the desire to call out bad driving. In that kind of case, if my colleague still performs the same action, she still hoots at the driver, then it will likely be for a completely different set of considerations. Perhaps she's trying to say hi to her friend, something like that. But for me, I'm still angry at that driver and for breaking the rules of the road. So I could actually still be acting for the very same considerations. So there's an important difference between these two cases. So what we see is that when it comes to action, the intentional and motivating elements in an emotional action are closely intertwined. There's a felt engagement with the world that is not simply tagging on a motivational edge, but where the motivational edge is built into the very way in which we are engaging with and apprehending the world. So I think, and I'm just going to say it because I don't really have a decent argument for this, but I think this means that ultimately the emotive and the non-emotive agent are actually acting for very, very different considerations. Even if it could be captured with the same words of saying the other driver has done wrong by breaking the rules of the road. And centering on reasons, my worry is that it risks failing to capture this crucial nuance to emotional actions. And we don't want to lose what is emotional about emotional actions. At the very least, it risks overlooking an important difference between the ways in which the emotive and non-emotive agents may see the very same set of considerations. So it just risks giving a very sort of anemic picture of what an emotional action would be, just trying to focus on this kind of reason responsiveness. So how then can we flesh out the relevance of intentional feelings for emotional actions and develop this claim that I'm making that the intentional and motivational elements are intricately connected, and this requirement that we've got to capture that if we are to capture what is emotional about our emotional and hopefully also rational actions? And here I think we can appeal to how emotions form parts of wider patterns of response. So what's absolutely crucial is that we don't undergo an emotion in response to just anything. We react emotionally to things that have putative significance to ourselves. So as Michael Brady puts it, and it's on the slide, it's a platitude that emotions constitute reactions to objects, events, and states of affairs that are potentially significant or important to us. Where what is significant is couched against our background cares and concerns, the things we care about. When we experience an emotion, we engage with the world in terms of how the things we care about are apprehended as being affected. So this comes up a lot in sort of philosophy and psychology, definitely sort of theories informed by appraisal theories. And there's this background set of cares and concerns that are almost background conditions for having an emotion in the first place. But having cares or concerns is an inherently affective phenomenon. If you care about something, it feels a particular way. So because of this, we can make sense of why emotions involve intentional feelings at all. It's not this sort of mysterious thing that happens. Why? Because emotions are intentional in that they are about things at which they are directed, yes, but also quite crucially, they are responsive to how the things we care about are apprehended as being affected. A picture of intentional feelings grounded in a person's background cares and concerns thus helps to make sense of that felt engagement with the world that's so familiar with emotions. Note, however, that emotions do not simply manifest in isolated events. Rather, we have rich and interconnected emotional lives, where what a person experiences at any one time connects to other emotional episodes, dispositions, and traits at that time and over time. And this is something that Bennett Helm and Monica Betzler have developed really nicely. If you get upset when one of your parents is taken suddenly ill, for instance, you are typically disposed to feel relief when they are discharged from hospital, but also to enjoy their company and relish in their successes. A common thread to our emotional lives is that we respond to things that have significance to us given what we care about. In this example, your background cares for your parents, where if you were to fail to respond emotionally when they're at risk or when they have successes, we would actually question whether you really do care about them. Instead, responding emotionally is only one way in which someone might be disposed to react to how her cares and concerns are apprehended as being affected, where she might also be disposed to behave or act or even believe in other ways. And to a certain extent, these could be defined as different ways in which an associated action tendency towards a class of action could be instantiated. So just as we might question if you care about your parents when one suddenly falls ill, but you have no related emotional response, we might question if you care if you weren't also motivated to act in ways to protect them, such as to rush to the hospital to be with them. So we've got the background cares and concerns sort of in the center here, giving rise to a whole bunch of different dispositions and behaviors. Uncovering the background role of cares and concerns in our emotional responses thus does two things. Firstly, it can make sense of why emotions involve intentional feelings in the first place. And secondly, it exposes how emotions form part of a larger pattern of response motivated by how one's cares and concerns are apprehended as being affected in the center there. So when we undergo an emotional response, the idea is that we actually express a commitment to those cares. It's a way of saying, yes, I do care, I am caring, as well as expressing a commitment to a pattern of response appropriate to how those cares are apprehended as being affected. So my claim here is very, very similar to one that Bennett Helm makes, according to which having an emotion is to be committed to the import of the things one cares about. There are some sort of important differences between the strength of our claim. Helm then wants to say that not experiencing related emotions is a rational failure. I think that's a step too far, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole now. What I just want to lay on the table now is just that we've got the wherewithal for capturing how emotions, as intentional feelings, with the central involvement of the background cares and concerns in this whole pattern of response, it gives us the wherewithal for capturing how emotions could feature in a rationally rich role in practical agency. Not necessarily as reason trackers, but actually as commitments to related action. And before going any further, I just want to flag that I know that everything I'm saying so far would apply to human agents, it would apply to non-human animals, it would apply to human infants, even though we tend not to think of animals and infants as rational agents. So I'm just talking about emotion and emotional sort of phenomenology. And if we allow that a range of different creatures experience emotions, then yeah, everything I'm saying probably applies to them as well. I'm going to return to this issue below, as it's going to be central in my ultimate proposal, the sort of solution to this, which is that we've got to view emotional actions as within a broader context of there already being a rational agent. And what I really just want to focus on now, though, is to make some, I guess we can call them descriptive claims about emotional phenomenology. And these are claims that I admit will potentially be true for any emotional action, whether it is the action or behavior of a rational agent or not. So I'm flagging that. I know that that's a problem, and I'm going to come back to it. So let's turn to commitments. And here I'm also on a sort of approaching this on a very sort of descriptive level. And I'm just going to sort of say a little bit about how we find, well, what we can say about commitments, at least as they feature in philosophy of action. And here, commitments are typically seen as very, very closely related to intentions. So Michael Bratman, for instance, argues that intentions involve a commitment to action, where having a commitment is having a set of dispositions towards reasoning and towards action. Much more recently, Facundo Alonso has argued that commitments involve an intention. So it's going, proposals for, the relation going either way. And either way we take it, right, we can just see that it's being illustrated here that there's a close connection between commitments and intentions. Now, simply reflecting on the phenomenology of emotional action, and quite specifically there, the sort of phenomenology of the emotional action tendencies, I think, brings out some prima facie similarities to something like commitment. They're prima facie because much of the literature looking at commitments operates in a theoretical framework that might not be conducive to taking emotional actions seriously as rational actions. That's always going to be the problem, right? A lot of sort of discussions of rational agency either just don't tackle emotion or explicitly want to exclude emotion from the realm of rationality. So we're not going to have a one-to-one correspondence necessarily. It's going to be a bit tough, but that's what I want to be challenging, right? So my aim then is just to identify some prima facie similarities between emotion or emotional actions and commitments, and use those as a springboard for developing a picture of how emotions could involve commitments to action in a rationally rich way. To do this, I'm going to draw on Alonso's recent case for a hybrid view of commitments. Why do I draw on this view? A few reasons. One is it's a chapter in 2024. It's recent. I've read it recently. It's top of my mind. So that's quite handy, but a very poor reason for developing an argument. So more substantially, I draw on Alonso for these two reasons. The first is that he explicitly follows those like Elizabeth Anscombe in accepting that acting intentionally is not the same as acting for a reason. So I also agree with that. I think that's correct. Acting intentionally is not the same as acting for a reason. And I also think it's crucial for creating space for emotional actions in the first place. So an important background commitment there. Secondly, Alonso allows that we can have what he calls mere intentions, which are intentions not formed as the outcome of conscious deliberation about what to do. They are intentions we might have for no reason, as he puts it. And this is compatible with the kind of impulsive and semi-deliberate actions that I described at the beginning, and in any event, allowing that intentional actions can arise without conscious deliberation is exactly why I want to look closer at emotional actions. So this allowance of mere intentions is, again, compatible with my broader project. Just as an aside, I think if the proposal that I want to develop here can take off, I think an interesting consequence could be that if there's something like an intention in emotional action, it's not going to be an intention for a reason, but it's also not quite a mere intention. The role of the intentional nature, using a different form of intentional here, the role of the intentional nature of emotion could create scope for there being something in the middle. We could have intentions, action intentions, that maybe not formed for a reason, but also not formed for no reason at all. Okay, so what are commitments then for Alonso? They're hybrid, containing an element of intention and an element of normative endorsement. So as he puts it, and I've got this up on the slide here, one's commitment to phi is partly constituted by one's intention to phi and by one's endorsement of certain reasons for phiing as normative for one's intention to phi, where such reasons are seen by oneself as strong enough to outweigh or defeat various reasons for not phiing. So can this hybrid view of commitments capture some of the phenomenology at the center of emotional actions? Again, just the disclaimer that I'm approaching this from a very descriptive direction. So let's look first at this intentional element. And allowing the existence of mere intentions not had for reasons, is really important here. An intention can be understood functionally as a cluster of dispositions towards reasoning and action, as Alonso suggests. But this is what, or at least very similar to what I have proposed as being core to emotion. Emotions involve a pattern of response, or are parts of a pattern of response, which also includes action tendencies, where we are disposed to act and think in certain ways based on our background cares and concerns, sitting in the middle of that little web. This is the case in impulsive actions and in semi-deliberate actions. So descriptively, at least, we can make sense of there being something that we could label an emotional proto-intention, because of this emotion being part of a pattern of response with action tendencies. Now, the descriptively qualification is important here. I'm not arguing that emotion involves an intention. That will be a lot trickier to claim. And anyway, we do not typically think of an emotion's action tendency as being akin to the far richer notion of intention. And this is ultimately the sort of two analogues that I'm drawing on here. It's ultimately the action tendency that I'm appealing to here as doing the work of this intention. My aim and claim is much more minimal. It's just that to say that there is something that could be a candidate for an intention, something that is relevantly similar to an intention, which we could then use as the basis to translate into there being something like an emotional commitment to action. What about the normative endorsement? Is there also plausibly the possibility of something like a normative endorsement for emotion? So what Alonso means by this normative endorsement is that the agent endorses, and I'm reading from the slide, certain reasons for so acting as being normative for her intention. The normative endorsement is something like the acceptance that there are reasons for the intention. Together with the mere intention, this actually leads Alonso to say that, and I'm quoting from him, a commitment to act is nothing but a reasons-based intention to so act. So for him, we've got the intention, we've got this normative endorsement. It's now saying, well, the commitment just amounts to saying that there's a reason for the intention. Now, I think that we can make a case for there being a normative endorsement or something suitably similar in the case of emotion. And again, to do that, we need to appeal to the background cares and concerns. Because there are these background cares and concerns, the agent does have a vested interest in the situation where, without further reflection, this vested interest pushes the agent towards a default acceptance of things being the way that the emotion presents them as being. We often think of emotions as being kind of almost passive, or sort of receptive, with this default position of just accepting that things are as the emotion presents them. Now, Jean-Moritz Müller discusses the spontaneity of emotion. And I think some of his ideas are actually quite useful to draw on in order to develop this picture a bit more. So according to Muller, and here I quote, to feel an emotion is to comply with a real or purported normative reason constituted by a real or purported exemplification of its formal object. So formal object, what he's referring to are those evaluative relations that make up the intentional element of an emotion. So without getting into details, how Muller develops this case is by drawing on the phenomenological tradition to conceive of compliance here as something like the registering of normative force in a way that is unreflective and non-voluntary, where the formal objects of emotions, those evaluative relations or evaluative relational properties, have some kind of normative authority over us because of our background concerns and cares. So if we use Muller's terms here, we see that there's something like compliance, unreflective, non-voluntary, to the normative authority of what the emotion is about, which could be a form, sort of at least a proto-form of a normative endorsement. So let's go back to the action examples from the beginning to illustrate how this would work. So even in the case of impulsive action, there is an acceptance of things being the way in which the agent apprehends them as being emotively. So my slapping of my colleague in infuriation, I'm just accepting that my colleague has done something wrong. My push to run away from the bear in the fearsome bear example is supported by my compliance to the normative authority of the dangerousness of the bear. I accept that the bear is dangerous. And semi-deliberate actions, in turn, I may engage in some means and reasoning about how to get back at my mean colleague, but crucially what I'm doing there is I'm complying with the normative authority of the offensiveness of the action. I'm not questioning that normative authority. I'm running with it. So as a last note on the normative endorsement, it's worth just saying that Alonso does in fact highlight that paradigmatic cases of commitment are those where the agent where the reasons that support an agent's intentions have a source in what she deeply values or cares about, Alonso's words. This is exactly what would be going on in an emotional commitment. So there's a nice little similarity happening here, drawing on the things that the agent deeply values and cares about. So what I'm proposing then is we can draw parallels between Alonso's emotional commitments and something like an emotional commitment. While Alonso talks about the element of intention and an element of normative endorsement in the commitment, we can talk about something like the action tendency as a type of proto-intention and the compliance to the normative authority of what the emotion is about as a form of a normative endorsement, or as this doing the equivalent work as a normative endorsement. Perhaps the emotional commitment is just a proto-commitment, but it's heading in the right direction. Without further interrogation, there is at least a prima facie case to be made for taking emotions seriously as commitments to action. But I'm going to make things a bit more complicated, and I'm coming to the end. I mentioned earlier that everything I was saying about background cares and concerns when talking about emotion and emotional phenomenology would plausibly apply to animals and human infants too. Yet, we don't think of these as rational agents. Further, otherwise rational agents may not reflectively identify with the care that underlies an emotional response. We see this in the case with implicit biases, for instance. So as an example, someone brought up with racist values may come to reject those values, but still experience adverse emotions when coming face to face with someone of another race. So while we can explain her emotion as evidence of the persistence of these ingrained values that she has now rejected, her emotion nevertheless conflicts with what she reflectively takes herself to care about, and there's something wrong-headed if I'm going to have to end up describing her action as rational, given that the action goes against her values, her reflectively endorsed values, and goes against what she believes she ought to do. So we do need to narrow our focus to rule out these kind of actors as coming out as rational agents or performing rational actions. And I think the way to narrow our focus is to expand it in another direction. And that's to say, well, look, these are one kind of action that an otherwise rational agent could do. And what's going to do the important work here is a much more holistic picture of rational agency, where the agent is meeting conditions for being a rational agent otherwise. So one of the central conceptions of rational agency that we find is that rational agents act for reasons seen as reasons. We guide our actions by the things that we think we should guide our actions by. So we can call this the notion of rational guidance. And rational guidance like this does require certain capacities and dispositions within an agent. So for instance, it requires that an agent has the ability to critically reflect on her reasons and actions, that she's disposed to do so when required, and that she's disposed to let the results of her critical reflections inform her subsequent behavior. So Karen Jones has developed a nice sort of picture of rational agency here, which is what I'm drawing on, but we find similar ideas with Scanlon. So I'm not suggesting anything brand new here. Further, as rational agents, we do need to ensure that our emotions align with the cares and concerns that genuinely do form part of our values. And this illustrates the importance of another important contention that Jones has, which is that as rational agents, if we want our emotional actions to translate into rational actions, we actually need to monitor and cultivate our emotions so that they do reflect the considerations we endorse as reason giving. But now we've got a picture where we've got, if we are rational agents who monitor and cultivate our emotions, who have relevant dispositions required for rational agency, it's not going to be enough that we simply have these background cares and concerns. As rational agents, we also have to identify with the things we care about. So I've argued that elsewhere. But where does this leave us? Basically, if we are just looking at emotional actions and behaviors across the board, then emotional phenomenology is not going to be enough to hone in on what makes action rational. But if we are looking at emotional actions as a sort of a subset of the actions of an otherwise rational agent who's meeting those conditions for rational agency, then in virtue of how they have those other crucial dispositions, an emotional action could gain a new status as a rational action. Now, I don't think that there's anything problematic with describing how emotions could involve a commitment to action in a way that is so expansive that it lets in actors and actions that we do not want to count as rational. This actually seems like a correct approach to me. Emotional actions are not our paradigmatic rational actions, nor should we be trying to make them so. So they're not going to tick all those boxes. But if we grant that an agent is otherwise rational and meets certain conditions regarding there being a responsible rational agent, then we can develop a richer and more holistic picture of how rational agents do indeed engage with the world, including emotionally. In virtue of having dispositions and tendencies core to being rational, then we can be allowed to act emotionally without thereby undermining either our or our actions' status as rational. And that is what my approach captures. And indeed, I think developing a background picture of necessary dispositions is also compatible with viewing emotions as commitments to action. So here's another sort of point in favor of my proposal. So as Alonso writes regarding just normal action commitments, the stronger one deems one's intentions for an end to be supported by reasons, the wider the set of circumstances in which one is willing to pursue that end. And this can potentially capture the added involvement of the dispositions of the rational agent. The rational agent, who reflectively endorses her background cares and concerns and exercises the relevant dispositions and capacities of a rational agent, including monitoring and cultivating her reason-giving mechanisms like emotion, is one who plausibly sees an emotional action as being supported by reasons. And the more one does reflect on one's emotions and emotional experiences and values and cares and all of that, the more robust acting on those reasons would be. The way in which our rational deliberation can kick in and counter our emotional tendencies can weaken the emotional commitment, but similarly it can strengthen it by our conscious endorsement. So we end up with a spectrum from sort of weak emotional commitments through to strong, almost rational commitments. And that does capture the sort of importance that we do still give to things like deliberation. Okay, so just in summary then, where are we? I've been proposing that expanding on emotions as a kind of commitment to action promises to accommodate intentional feelings and the phenomenology of our emotional actions because of the role of background cares and concerns. So I set up that requirement that we need to keep the emotional within our emotional actions. And we can make a prima facie case for emotions involving something like a proto-commitment to action, based on the involvement of action tendencies and normative compliance to the authority, the normative authority of what the emotion is about. But once we build up a more holistic picture, sort of background picture of the rational agent and her necessary dispositions, then it becomes possible to think of emotional commitments not merely as proto-commitments to action, but as an important form that a commitment to action can and does actually take. Thank you.